It was a sunny winter afternoon when Thomas, a man in his mid-40s, trudged through the streets of his quiet suburban neighborhood. He had always been a solitary person, the kind who preferred the quiet company of books or the hum of the TV to the laughter of family or the chatter of friends. He had lost his wife years ago, and his heart had slowly turned cold, much like the weather that enveloped his home. Walking home from the grocery store, his thoughts were clouded with the usual stresses of life: work, bills, and loneliness. As he was passing by a park, something small caught his eye: an injured puppy, no more than a few months old, trembling on the side of the road. The puppy's fur was matted and dirty, and it let out a soft, pitiful whine when it saw Thomas. He approached cautiously, almost reluctantly, not sure what to do. He wasn't fond of animals, especially dogs. They were loud, needy, and messy. But this puppy, this little creature, needed help, and for reasons he couldn't quite understand. Thomas couldn't just leave it there. After a moment's hesitation, he scooped the puppy into his arms, his heart thudding in his chest. It was the first time in years he felt like he was doing something selfless. The puppy nuzzled into his coat, shivering but trusting, as Thomas carefully made his way home. Over the next few days, Thomas set the puppy up in his spare room, feeding it and tending to its injuries. Despite his initial reluctance, the puppy quickly became attached to him. Every time Thomas entered the room, the dog would wag its tail excitedly and try to jump into his lap. Thomas, however, remained distant. "I can't keep you," he muttered more than once, the words directed at the puppy, who would simply tilt its head and stare up at him with large, innocent eyes. "I'll find you a good home, someone who wants you." But the puppy wouldn't have it. Every time Thomas would leave the house to look for potential adopters, the dog would find a way to escape the room, no matter how carefully Thomas had locked it up, and follow him. It was almost as if the puppy was determined to stay. At one point, Thomas was certain that this small, unassuming creature was playing some kind of trick on him. He tried multiple times to drop the puppy off at the shelter, but each time the dog would sneak out the moment he wasn't looking, running back to the house. Frustrated but oddly touched, Thomas finally gave in. "All right, fine. But you're not staying here long." As weeks turned into months, the bond between Thomas and the puppy grew, despite his attempts to resist it. The puppy, whom he had named Max, was always by his side, whether Thomas was sitting on the couch watching TV or working on his paperwork. Max would curl up next to him, his small body providing warmth and comfort. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Thomas sat in his favorite armchair, weary and aching. Max, sensing his mood, jumped up beside him and laid his head on Thomas's lap. The man absent-mindedly ran his fingers through the dog's fur, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're a pain in the neck, you know that?" he said, his voice soft but full of affection. Max responded with a joyful wag of his tail, his eyes full of love. Thomas let out a quiet chuckle and looked down at his dog, realizing something he hadn't allowed himself to admit for a long time. He was happy, truly happy, for the first time in years. Time continued to pass, but life had its way of reminding Thomas that nothing stays the same. He had taken in Max as a temporary measure, but now, with the dog firmly entrenched in his life, Thomas was faced with a difficult choice. He had met a new woman, and though their connection was genuine, she had made it clear she wasn't fond of dogs. One rainy evening, Thomas sat in the living room with Max curled at his feet, staring out the window. The decision was inevitable. He had to let Max go. He couldn't keep living like this, torn between his attachment to the dog and the life he was trying to build. The next morning, he placed Max in the car, driving to a nearby farm where a friend had offered to take him in. As they arrived, Thomas opened the car door and looked down at the dog, who was excited to be outside. Max jumped out, wagging his tail, but as Thomas turned to leave, the puppy paused. He looked back at his owner, his eyes full of confusion and sadness. "Goodbye, Max," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He turned quickly, unable to watch as the dog ran back toward him. But when he looked over his shoulder one last time, he saw Max walking slowly toward the house, glancing over his shoulder as if to say goodbye. Years passed and Thomas's life moved forward. He grew older, the wrinkles on his face deepening with each passing year. But one thing never changed. He missed Max. His heart ached for the dog, for the days when they were inseparable, when laughter and joy filled the air. The loneliness grew heavier over time, and every now and then Thomas would find himself standing at the window, looking down the street, hoping to see that familiar wagging tail. But Max was gone. Determined, Thomas spent the remaining years of his life trying to find his old friend. He called shelters, drove across town, and even spoke to his old neighbor. But there was no trace of Max. The years weighed heavily on him, and his health began to deteriorate. One cold autumn afternoon, as Thomas lay in his hospital bed, his body frail and weak, the weight of years pressing heavily on him, something miraculous happened. The door to his room creaked open, and in walked a small, familiar figure, Maximum. The dog, now older with streaks of gray in his fur, stood in the doorway, his tail wagging slowly but steadily. His eyes, once full of puppyish innocence, now carried a depth of wisdom and longing. As soon as their gazes met, time seemed to stop. For a moment there was only the soft beating of hearts that had shared so many memories. Max's eyes held the same sadness and love that Thomas had always remembered, but now it seemed as if those eyes were telling him everything. "I've missed you too. I've never forgotten you." Max took a few slow steps forward, his body trembling slightly, not from age but from the emotions he carried, from the long years of longing. He reached Thomas's bedside and gently placed his head on his lap, the same way he had done when he was a puppy. But now, Thomas felt a tear slip down his cheek, his heart breaking all over again. "Max," Thomas whispered, his voice fragile, barely above a breath, "I thought I'd never see you again." The words were thick with regret, guilt, and an overwhelming love he hadn't been able to express in years. Max, as if understanding, shifted his weight, nudging his head closer to Thomas's chest. The dog's eyes were wet, as though holding back tears of his own. Or perhaps they were just a reflection of the deep bond that had never truly broken. The warmth of his presence flooded Thomas's heart, filling the emptiness he had carried for so long. "I'm sorry," Thomas murmured, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to leave you, but I thought you were better off without me. I... I couldn't live with myself knowing I was holding you back." Max responded by letting out a soft, almost sorrowful whine, as if saying, "I never wanted to leave you either." His tail flickered weakly, brushing against the floor, the joy of being reunited with his beloved owner clear in his eyes, despite the sadness that lingered. For all the years apart, Max had never forgotten the love they had shared. Through every home, every family, every moment, he had carried that love in his heart, waiting for this very moment. Max stayed close, his presence a comfort, as if reassuring Thomas that everything would be all right now. Thomas, too weak to speak, simply caressed Max's head, running his fingers through his fur, feeling the familiar warmth that had once been a constant companion in his life. And then, as Thomas felt his strength slowly fading away, he closed his eyes, his heart at peace. He could feel Max's head on his chest, the sound of the dog's breath steady, filling the room with a quiet calm. Max remained there, refusing to leave, just as he had done all those years ago, proving once more that no amount of time or distance could erase the love they shared. But as the last breath left Thomas's body, Max slowly stood, his eyes lingering one last time on the man he had never stopped loving. With a deep, mournful sigh, Max turned toward the door, his tail swishing softly behind him. As he walked away, his steps slow and heavy, he paused at the threshold and looked back. "I'll wait for you," the gaze seemed to say. And with that, Max disappeared into the unknown, his figure melting into the quiet darkness of the night. As the camera lingered on the empty room, a soft wind blew through the open window. The leaves danced outside, and for a fleeting moment, the air seemed to carry a whisper. The bond remains, even in the silence. Max had found his way back to Thomas one last time, but now, with his owner gone, the dog would carry on, honoring the love they had shared, waiting for the day they would meet again.